El mensaje frente a la captura de Popeye tiene que ser claro y contundente.
In the shadowed corridors of Bogotá's National Cancer Institute, the early morning of February 6, 2020, unfolded quietly, a soft veil of darkness clinging to the hospital walls. The city slept, unaware that one of the most infamous men in Colombia's violent history was drawing his last breath. John Jairo Velázquez, known to the world as Popeye, lay in a cold hospital bed, his once iron grip on life slipping into the abyss. The man who had unleashed terror across Colombia, who had brought down politicians and orchestrated bombings with the cold efficiency of a well-oiled machine, was now a husk of his former self, ravaged by cancer, fighting a losing battle against time. There was a chill in the air that morning, not just the chill of death approaching, but the kind of cold that clung to a man steeped in the blood of so many. He had lived by violence, and for decades, he had thrived in it. His enemies had fallen, his allies had crumbled, and even his most loyal comrades had been reduced to nothing but names on tombstones. And now, Popeye, the last remnant of a blood-soaked empire, lay dying, not in the fire of gunshots or the blaze of an explosion, but quietly, unceremoniously, under the sterile, indifferent gaze of hospital lights. He was 57, though the years had made him feel 100. His body, now withered and fragile, had once carried the weight of Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel on its shoulders. The doctors fought to keep him alive, but how could they hope to revive a man whose soul had been blackened by years of unimaginable brutality? No amount of medicine could heal the wounds of a past filled with betrayal, death, and terror. And as the night dragged on, the memories, the nightmares, clawed their way to the surface of his fading consciousness. A child of violence. Popeye wasn't always destined for a life of crime, but perhaps the seeds of violence were sown in him long before he was old enough to realize it. Born on April 15, 1962 in Yarumal, Antioquia, he grew up in a Colombia that was already at war with itself, where poverty and inequality bred anger and resentment. The streets were ruthless, and survival was not guaranteed. From an early age, John Jairo was fascinated by the stark divide between the rich and the poor. He was no stranger to hardship, but when he looked at the powerful men, the drug lords who drove their expensive cars and lived in their mansions, he saw more than wealth. He saw freedom. He saw power. It was during one of his childhood wanderings that he stumbled upon Fernando Galeano's mansion, one of the era's notorious drug bosses. The luxury, the untouchable aura of power. Young John Jairo couldn't help but be drawn to it. But curiosity came with a price. He was caught and beaten by Galeano's men, a harsh reminder that in this world, admiration meant nothing without muscle to back it up. That encounter didn't scare him. It ignited him. From that day on, the boy from Antioquia began walking a path that would lead him straight into the belly of Colombia's most feared cartel, the making of a hitman. Before he became Popeye, Velázquez dabbled in respectability. He attended the General Santander Police Cadet School, hoping that the uniform might give him the power he craved. But it wasn't enough. There was no thrill in enforcing the law when it was the law that felt weak and fragile in the face of the cartels. His stint at the Navy School was similarly fruitless, and so Velázquez wandered, trying on different lives like a man unsure of which mask to wear. He worked as a barber in Medellin, trimming hair in the neighborhoods of Robledo Maruchenga and Boston, watching as the world around him descended into chaos and opportunity. It wasn't until 1984 that fate presented him with the path he was meant to take. Through a chance connection, he became the bodyguard for Elsie Sofia Escobar Muriel, the national queen of livestock. And it was through her that he came face to face with the man who would change his life forever, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Popeye knew, even then, that his life was about to change. When Elsie Sofia's relationship with Escobar ended, Velázquez was left jobless, but he didn't hesitate. He approached Escobar directly, throwing himself at the drug lord's mercy. "Either you employ me, or you kill me," he said. The choice was clear, and Escobar, always a man who saw potential in the ruthless, welcomed him into the Medellin cartel. A reign of blood. What followed was a descent into a world darker than anything Velázquez had ever imagined. In the cartel, Velázquez found his calling. He became Escobar's most loyal enforcer, the feared head of the cartel's hitmen, the man who would kill without question, without hesitation. His hands were stained with the blood of politicians, police officers, journalists, anyone who stood in Escobar's way. He participated in over 300 murders, each one a notch in his belt, each one a reminder that in this world, only the ruthless survive. The crimes blurred together after a while, kidnapping the mayoral candidate Andrés Pastrana, who would later become president of Colombia, the murder of Attorney General Carlos Mauro Hoyos, the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 that killed 110 innocent people. Each act was a service to the cartel, to Escobar, but to Velázquez, they were just another day at work. He lived for the thrill, for the fear he instilled in others, for the power that came with pulling the trigger. But among all the bodies, among all the lives taken, there was one death that haunted him more than the rest. Wendy, the love and the betrayal. Her name was Wendy Chavarriaga Gil, and she was unlike anyone Velázquez had ever met. Tall, beautiful, with piercing green eyes that could hold a man captive, Wendy was a queen in her own right. She lived in luxury, in a mansion just blocks away from Escobar's residence, and she had everything she wanted, except freedom. She was one of Escobar's many lovers, but she was different. She defied him, tested the boundaries of his control, and eventually, she paid the price. When Wendy became pregnant, Escobar, furious that she had broken his strictest rule, forced her to undergo a brutal abortion. The procedure was carried out by a veterinarian under Escobar's cold, calculating gaze. Velázquez watched as the woman he loved was reduced to a shell of her former self, bleeding and broken in front of him. But Wendy was not a woman to be broken easily. She sought revenge, and in her desperation, she turned to the authorities, becoming an informant for the DEA in their hunt for Escobar. Popeye knew what this meant. Escobar had spies everywhere, and it didn't take long for the cartel to discover Wendy's betrayal. Escobar gave Velázquez an ultimatum. Either he killed Wendy, or he would be killed himself. It was a test of loyalty, a cruel twist of fate that forced Popeye to choose between his love and his life. And in the end, he chose survival. He sent 5 hitmen to end Wendy's life, knowing that the moment her heart stopped beating, a part of him would die with her. Years later, as he lay dying in that hospital bed, Velázquez would still remember the look in her eyes, the way her smile had once lit up the dark world they lived in. "I loved her with all my soul," he had said once, but love meant nothing in the face of the cartel's iron rule. Wendy was gone, and with her, any chance Velázquez had of redemption. The fall of the cartel and the death of Popeye. The Medellin cartel's reign couldn't last forever. As Escobar's empire crumbled, Velázquez, like many cartel soldiers, was arrested. In 1992, he was sentenced for terrorism, murder, and conspiracy. He spent years in prison, earning 14 diplomas, and attempting to fashion himself as a changed man, but his past clung to him like a shadow. Even after his release in 2014, controversy followed. His YouTube channel, Popeye Repentant, attracted millions of followers, but beneath the surface, he remained the same, hardened, unrepentant, and tainted by the blood on his hands. In 2018, cancer invaded his body, spreading from his esophagus to his lungs and liver. He was transferred to Bogotá, where his once fearsome body wasted away. On a cold February morning, with the weight of his sins heavy on his soul, he took his last breath. Yet even in death, Popeye's story refuses to end. His legacy is one of destruction and pain. A man who rose to power through violence and fell just as swiftly. The streets of Medellin still whisper his name, and those he left behind carry the scars of his actions. As the lights dimmed in that hospital room and his eyes finally closed, perhaps Popeye could still hear the echoes of his past, the gunshots, the screams, and the voice of a woman he once loved, calling out his name.